Kia ora. I want to begin by acknowledging the ancestors of this land on whose expulsion and colonization we sit, and that constitutes the fundamental infrastructure on which I'm speaking today. I want to take this moment also to thank my ancestors who have taught me the importance of social justice as the anchor to the generation of knowledge. I want to thank those union organizers, activists, left party organizers, anti-colonial protesters that form the basis of the conversation that I'm going to join into today. I also finally want to thank Lee for organizing this special panel that brings together some of my favorite scholars to think about and discuss what open science looks like and what the conversation on open science ought to be looking at as we um, consider the horizon. I'm going to frame my talk in terms of the question of epistemicide, the usage of colonial tools to fundamentally erase sites of knowledge production in the global south, and discuss the ways in which we can resist epistemicide through the active work of building knowledge infrastructures. The way this talk will be presented then is that I will begin by discussing the question of epistemicide as the setting for framing the culture-centered approach, which is the approach that I've been working on over the last 2 decades, with the question of what does it mean to listen to voices at the subaltern margins that have historically and systematically been erased from discursive spaces. I will then discuss the question of subaltern science and indigenous knowledge production, the ways in which indigenous knowledge um, intervenes into hegemonic structures of knowledge production, and how then does that offer an imaginary for indigenous futures. What I have for you here as a way to frame this conversation is an image of a women, mostly Dalit or untouchable women, organized within the context of India's agrarian margins, India's rural margins, in the backdrop of the large scale epidemic of farmer suicides in India. And they're organizing to put forth and to circulate an indigenous form of agriculture that is embedded in indigenous science and indigenous practice, but also is deeply committed to interrupting and disrupting the neo-colonial, neoliberal project. So this work of the women takes the form of the Millet Network, which is anchored in the production of and the circulation of millets as climate-resistant crops that are embedded in indigenous livelihoods and indigenous struggles. So the concept of epistemicide is rooted in the acknowledgement that the production of knowledge, and more specifically, the production of scientific knowledge, is a colonial capitalist project. Uh, Knowledge itself, as an instrument, works to perpetuate capital, to create new markets for capital, while at the same time colonizing new spaces, bringing these spaces under the control of capital. In fact, the frontiers of contemporary neoliberalism constitute new forms of colonialism that venture into indigenous lands, indigenous livelihoods, in order to A, expel indigenous peoples from their spaces of living, and B, to co-opt indigenous forms of knowledge in order to circulate capital and create new extractive zones of profiteering. So the project of science, in this sense, is embedded in the logics of whiteness, the norms of whiteness, the principles of whiteness that use science and deploy science in particular ways in order to exclude sciences from the margins. Here, the key point to note is that the margins then are actively created through works of erasure. The processes of communicative erasure, the processes of delegitimization, the processes of stigmatization, the processes of stealing off the agency of subaltern peoples works precisely to prop up a form of science that perpetuates the colonial exercise. And within this colonial exercise, then, is the concept of colonial theft. We, of course, witness that in the form of biopiracy, the stealing of indigenous germplasm, indigenous life, indigenous biologies in order to create networks of profiteering. But we also see it in terms of the stealing of indigenous spaces, indigenous land, indigenous sites of inhabiting, water, mountains, those spaces that are considered sacred, often under the rhetoric of science and through the deployment of technologies of science. So, although the argument, of course, often goes that, oh, you have to separate science from the specific techniques and technologies, from an indigenous standpoint, science itself is an instrument of whiteness that holds up and reproduces these technologies. So the kind of techno-deterministic solutions that are put forth to address global crises then work to perpetuate these new forms of colonization. A great example of this, for instance, is if you look at the sustainable futures and the framework of sustainable science that is put forth, it is often again embedded within the hegemonic structures of colonization while simultaneously erasing the subaltern communities from the margins. So colonial destruction in that sense is inherent in the production of transnational markets. Indigenous livelihoods, forms of living must be destroyed so that markets can be created, markets can be upheld, and markets can be circulated across spaces. So this work of epistemicide, the erasure of indigenous ways of knowledge generation, of indigenous knowledge claims, is both material and symbolic. At the symbolic level, it works through the deployment of colonial communication infrastructures that are consistently at work to delegitimize indigenous knowledge, to stigmatize indigenous knowledge in order to create the market mechanisms for hegemonic white science. At the same time, the violence is material because in order to carry out these expulsions and extractions, indigenous peoples must be removed from their spaces of livelihood, often through the use of force, through the deployment of the police and the military. So you see this in the frontiers of neoliberal capital, that the ongoing attacks of capital are deployed through the arms of the state, through the deployment of the military, paramilitary, and the police in order to murder, in order to incarcerate, and then fundamentally in order to silence indigenous voices of protest. So the question then, with respect to the problem of epistemicide, is how do we take the challenge for open science and decolonize it in ways that interrogate its whiteness and that interrogates its normative logics that perpetuate the colonial capitalist project. So decolonization in this sense is not about creating an invitational dialogic space, but it is fundamentally anti-colonial. It is resistive in its urgency, in seeking to dismantle the forms, the structures, and the spaces of knowledge production that are embedded in logics of whiteness. Because whiteness in its colonial forms is violence, because whiteness in its colonial form is murder. Whiteness in its colonial forms is extraction and expulsion. So, from an indigenous standpoint, the problem of decolonization, or the challenge of decolonization, is one of actually taking down the sides that perpetuate whiteness and its logics, dismantling those spaces where science is generated and where the narrative of science is deployed precisely to erase, precisely to expel, and to create new markets through these processes of expulsion, disrupting the claims of open science and the logics that constitute these claims. So, decolonizing framework invites us to interrogate the fundamental ideologies that are embedded in the ideas of openness. So, who sets the terms of openness? Who operationally defines what is open, for what purposes, and to serve whose purposes? If you, for instance, take the simple idea of transparency from the standpoint of indigenous struggles, or when you locate this question of transparency amidst indigenous struggles, you realize, or you recognize, that in fact transparency and its tools pretty much have served to colonize. So the language of transparency has often been used in order to steal the indigenous life forms, indigenous bioforms, indigenous knowledge systems, and indigenous science, in order to incorporate them into the white man's narrative of conquest, and circulation. So the urgency of the indigenous future then is in recognizing logics such as transparency and the colonial habits that are written into such logics. Similarly, an indigenous interrogation points to the question of data. Who gathers the data? This is especially important when indigenous bodies, indigenous genes, the indigenous DNA is incorporated into colonizing circuits of profiteering, while at the same time carrying out the expulsion, erasure, and violence on indigenous peoples. So these questions of data and transparency from the perspective of decolonization have to be anchored in questions of sovereignty, data sovereignty in terms of ownership of data and ownership of information, research sovereignty in terms of sovereignty over the research process, turning this lens of ownership on its head and really asking the question of where are those infrastructures placed, where knowledge is generated to serve whom, and really working in resistance to hegemonic structures to locate or to move these infrastructures into indigenous domains of knowledge generation that serve the life goals, the agentic imaginaries of indigenous communities embedded very much in the struggles for indigenous life and livelihood. So how do we then safeguard infrastructures of indigenous science? This is a critical question, and this is particularly so because of the violence that is often deployed in order to co-opt and steal indigenous science. So we have an image here of the women farmers in south of India, in Telangana, India, who organize in sanghams or women's cooperatives, working with the women's ways of knowing agriculture and the science of agriculture to map out and plan how they are going to cultivate in the next season. So what you see here as an image is the women sitting together using chalk to mark out fields and then using branches, trees, leaves in order to create a planting pattern. And then this sort of um, uh, um, decision making is guided by the evidence that they have created from earlier agricultural cycles, from the everyday work of observation, and from the everyday work of challenging the structures of neoliberal cooptation. So this then, in terms of safeguarding the space, is also about um, safeguarding the various tools of violence, all the way from agriculture extension to the advertising and promotional efforts that are put forth by transnational corporations and the nation state in order to carry out this form of expulsion. So this really then leads to how do we intervene into the hegemonic structures of science with indigenous knowledge practices. So the question of openness and what constitutes openness is not discussed in elite cosmopolitan circuits located elsewhere, is not discussed and held control over in ICA conference sessions and in theme sessions, but rather is actually articulated, practiced, and put forth from within indigenous struggles, from within the struggles for voice, and from within the struggles for methodology, systematic observation, and the generation of scientific knowledge. So the culture-centered approach situated in this conversation invites us, offers us a methodological impetus to imagine the work of generating knowledge as cultivating in the works of, in the words of Gayatri Spivak, as cultivating the habits of learning to learn from below. So what does it mean to learn from below? And in this process, then continually decolonize and open up spaces that are committed to the struggles from below. How do we cultivate a habit of patient listening to an ethic of the other that is always and ever committed to the notion of erasure, to the recognition that the ways in which we participate in the production of science, in the creation and circulation of metrics, actually work to silence, to erase, and to perpetuate violence. And through this process, then, how do we work toward another imagination, which fundamentally is about inversion of the dominant structures of knowledge making and knowledge circulation? So, in order to create these infrastructures, the culture centered approach argues that we need to think about how we build communicative infrastructures that are anchored in equality, equality for opportunities for information, information related to specific claims, claims making of science, information related to methodology, information related to representation, and resources for representation in terms of who is doing the work of representing. So if you think about it in terms of communication research, when subaltern bodies are often scripted into hegemonic structures of communication knowledge in order to be written about by experts elsewhere, the question here becomes one of how do we decolonize these infrastructures of representation so that the processes of representation are owned by communities that are systematically erased? How do we co-create infrastructures for decision making, and fundamentally then how do we co-create infrastructures for voice? So communicative equality is about voice equality, about building opportunities for erased voices to be heard and for those registers to emerge as registers for imagining other possibilities. So ownership here relates to sort of six different forms of ownership that I could think of. One is ownership of knowledge infrastructures, where we make knowledge claims. Ownership of knowledge infrastructures for method, where we claim method as well as discuss method. Uh, Ownership of information infrastructures in terms of decision-making processes, who makes these decisions. In the context of the women's lives and livelihoods, they articulate that these decisions are often made by elite post-colonial men working together with elite institutions in the global north, all the way from development agencies to United Nations agencies to academic institutions in the north that determine the forms of agriculture that would work, that would often be considered sustainable in order to be disseminated in communities. And here, what is critical to recognize is that the terms of engagement are precisely co-opted in order to serve the agendas of neoliberal capital. So when you hear the term engagement in science communication and open science, the idea of engagement is built upon the logics of colonization, where to engage is to identify new channels in order to disseminate science. In other words, in order to perpetuate the colonizing project of white science. So, how then, in the backdrop of this, do we build infrastructures for decision making that are rooted in the struggles of subaltern communities of the global margins? How do we build resources for voice in terms of decision making method and then making knowledge claims? So here you have an image, and the women talk about this in the ongoing work of the Deccan Development Society, which is a collective of cooperatives or sanghams, where they come together to challenge this neoliberal onslaught of uh, commercialized capitalist agriculture. And they say that if you look at where this information is disseminated, if you look at the communication channels, they have been colonized. So when you look at radio, when you look at pamphlets that disseminate this information about biotechnology, about profit driven agriculture, they take place through communication channels that are fundamentally co-opted in capitalist logics. One has to pay high amounts of advertising rupees in order to place their messages on these channels. So it is really those with power, those with economic access, and those with political access that then tell the story of science, the practice of science, and the forms of knowledge that are presented as what would work. So for the women in their struggle, then the struggle for science and sovereignty in knowledge production, or what one might call as science sovereignty, is about communicative sovereignty. So, how do we build spaces of communication that are owned by us within decolonizing contexts and that create frameworks for our participation anchored in logics that we have created, rooted in our cultural lives, rather than forms of top-down engagement imposed by the status quo. So I want to walk through a couple of examples to demonstrate what I mean by voice infrastructures embedded in this idea of communication sovereignty and material interventions. As you will see here, the voice infrastructures are very much embedded in the materiality of everyday life and everyday struggles within this context for a say over agriculture, for a say over ecosystems and ecologies. What do you do when communicative spaces and architectures and infrastructures have been colonized? Within this context, then, within the context of this particular anti colonial struggle, it is the bullock carts embedded within the fabric of community life, the songs, the seed banks, the traveling seed banks that you can see that are carrying the seeds that belong in community, embedded in community life, rather than the seeds manufactured by transnational corporations that can only be bought and sold through the market. The street processions as they walk from village to village, these become the material sites for articulation. These are the voice architectures that are also the architectures for claims making and opening up science. So the process of co-creating communication infrastructures then is one about building spaces of communication sovereignty, spaces where claims can be made by those at the global margins, margins that are actively created by the processes of extraction and expulsion, and participate from these margins in terms that are determined by those at the margins, embedded within logics um, determined by those at the margins. How do we then build plural networks of solidarity that become ways of opening up science through conversations embedded in the everyday methods of struggles of the grassroots and at the subaltern margins. How do we connect across spaces in these struggles? And through these connections, how do we intervene into hegemonic structures? And the work of the women with millets as a climate resistant crop is a great example, because through that process, then they build the millet network that then brings this form of knowledge generation and this science of knowledge generation across spaces that travels across the global south. But what is also critical to note here is the importance of resistance and keeping intact the resistive politics. And that essentially means that one has to continually monitor, evaluate, and challenge the hegemonic structures that seek to co-opt and colonize. So how does generation of millets embedded in indigenous science then challenge the co-optive moves by the Gates corporations, the Gates Foundation, by transnational corporations to then take the millet and turn it into a commodity to profit global capital while actually excluding the women. So the struggle for indigenous science is also the struggle against hegemonic structures and building and sustaining bioresistance. So the work of bioresistance is the process of making claims through science and through the process of evidence making embedded within indigenous context, but also retaining the ownership over these claims within these contexts. So the question of science in this setting is turned on its head. For many indigenous struggles, it is about the question is about not just what we can share in order to create global frameworks and to build global spaces of resistance, but also what do we keep? What do we not share? What knowledge do we keep with us so that this is not turned into another site of colonization? So I will wrap up with playing a song from the women's work with agriculture and their struggle. Here they are singing to the seeds, and singing itself becomes a site for performing bioresistance. And then I will wrap up with this concept of communication sovereignty as a basis for decolonizing science. The concept of communication sovereignty then is about building and sustaining these communicative spaces that are owned by those at the margins of the margins. Through these processes of ownership, building, and sustaining material practices that are embedded in science and the processes of observation, the processes of drawing inferences based upon observation and developing theories, and at the same time embedded within the futures of indigenous sovereignty. And through these struggles for voice and ownership over scientific processes of decision making, interrogating sites of power, both power held by the state as well as power held by capital, and the ways in which then these networks of power are circulated through systems of knowledge production. So I want to wrap up by discussing the work of the indigenous Guatemalan activist Rigoberta Menchu, when she says that there are some stories that I'm going to share, and there are many others that I'm not going to share. This idea, this active idea of not sharing, of keeping as a way for resisting the processes of colonization is a vital register for conversations as we imagine open science, particularly within the context of contemporary global struggles of inequality, attacks on indigenous livelihoods, and climate change. Thank you so much for participating. Please do post your comments, and I'll be happy to respond to them. And it's really lovely to be on this panel, engaged with other speakers that are asking similar questions that critically interrogate the ideas of open science. Thank you.